Welcome back to the Greenwood, one and all. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this episode is the first in a series where we look at the more mystical side of Robin Hood. While he's long been a character that is somewhat controversially linked to the fairy trickster known as Robin Goodfellow, and writers such as John Matthews have drawn symbolic links between the outlaw and the overtly magical Arthurian figure known as the Green Knight, he mostly is presented in at least a semi-realistic historical context. His feats of archery are typically presented as extraordinary, but not really superhuman. And aside from a few odd works, like a 17th century play by Ben Jonson featuring Mother Maudlin, the shape-changing Witch of Papelwick, and the occasional Victorian reference to fairies, such as in Alfred Tennyson's The Foresters, one is hard-pressed to find direct links to the supernatural and Robin Hood that were written before the 20th century, especially not when one goes back to the surviving medieval ballads. However, once one does get into the 20th and 21st centuries, it becomes increasingly common to find tales of Robin Hood where the forest-dwelling outlaw becomes enmeshed with all sorts of supernatural entanglements. Easily the most notable of these adaptations, with a mystical element, is the ITV series Robin of Sherwood, that debuted in 1984. In fact, throughout this year, we'll be celebrating the 40th anniversary of the landmark show through various discussions and reviews. To further discuss just what it is about Robin Hood that encourages adding an element of the otherworldly, I sat down with magic realism filmmaker and host of the Dream Swarm podcast, Andy Mark Simpson. Our discussion covers fairy tale motifs, mythic archetypes, Robin and Marion's connection to pagan celebrations, and much more. Now, string your bow and prepare an enchantment or two as we enter the Greenwood with writer and filmmaker Andy Mark Simpson. So I was thinking what we could do tonight is I would just kind of want to examine a little bit of how Robin Hood dances around the periphery of the supernatural. It's
Mhm.
something we discussed when I was on your podcast, and just kind of like where we're identifying these links and why how it how he sort of lends himself towards that, and then how you personally have been inspired by Robin Hood, and in particular those supernatural elements, like what's driven you to make those kind of connections. Where have you seen
Thanks. Yeah.
those associations?
Yeah. Excellent. Cool. Yeah. I've been writing my Marion script today, actually, going back through everything, and I've made little notes in what the like for each of the characters, where the kind of mythological and folkloric and kind of supernatural things, kind of associations I have with each of those characters as well. So it might be something we explore, not just Robin Hood, but the associated characters as well.
Exactly. Yeah, that too, very much. Because there is a lot that one can examine there in some of those very particular characters, especially the more archetypal ones. And I think there are some really interesting ways to do that. Before we jump into that, though, would you please just introduce yourself to the audience, say who you are, and a little bit about both your podcast and your other work?
Yeah, sure. My name is Andy Mark Simpson, and I run the Dream Swarm podcast, which is a podcast that looks at fairy tales, folklores, magic realism, mythology, storytelling, art, in kind of supernatural elements to those storytelling and artwork. So I run that podcast, but I'm also a writer and filmmaker myself as well. So I've had a few films in cinema, and my work tends to be magic realism. So it combines kind of social issues with supernatural elements peppered into them. So it's something that I really like to look at, that melding of reality with uh, fantasy and supernatural elements kind of peppered in there.
Something that we've kind of discussed before, and we've discussed it a little bit over Twitter, over social media. You had me as a guest on your podcast to talk about Robin Hood, and it came up in discussion there as well. Is the idea of Robin Hood as a supernatural figure. And one of the things that's a little bit interesting about Robin Hood is how he is not overtly magical or supernatural in any sort of way. And I've touched upon this in a few other areas with the podcast. I interviewed historian Richard Firth Green, who wrote the book Elf Queens and Holy Friars, and discussed how he didn't really buy into the connection between Robin Goodfellow and Robin Hood. He thinks it's just a coincidence they had their names, but that was his opinion, and one can draw links in other places, and other people certainly have. He's not the final authority on the subject, and as I was discussing on the episode of your podcast, and I'll make sure to include links to the Dream Swarm and to in the episode description. Even when Robin Hood doesn't have overtly supernatural qualities, even if we don't see him, I don't know, casting spells like Merlin or like Puck or Robin Goodfellow, if even we don't see him do something that is supernatural specifically in a story and unquestionably, ooh, that was magic, he still has a very magical type of role. He still sort of fulfills the role that we see in fairy tales of a sort of woodland trickster figure. You get lost in the woods, or you get abducted by Robin and his men, you get brought to dinner. He's a tricksy figure. He takes disguises. This is something that comes up in the ballads all the time. Robin Hood is in disguise, and people are mistaking him or not recognizing him. People are so accustomed to seeing Robin Hood being disguised for the archery contest, which appears in a few movies, but it happens all the time in ballads. And that's also a very trickstery, folkloric sort of thing to do. Plus, there's just that idea of him living in the Greenwood. And then that's before we even get into his associations with the Mayday games. So it's easy to see how and why people can start to latch onto Robin Hood and make associations with him that have to do with fairy lore and the supernatural. And so I wanted to get your take on that in particular. Where do you most see the kind of easy supernatural connections with Robin Hood and the rest of the Merry Men?
Yeah, I think it is that element of being so connected to that forest and the folklore of the forest. So I think you're right in what you're saying, and you've had experts on the podcast who study the history of it. And I'm not coming at this as an expert or someone who's kind of questioning what they're saying in terms of the historical accuracy of that. Your previous guest was saying it's kind of coincidental that the link with Robin Goodfellow, and that there's not a kind of concrete historical link of the evolution of the Robin Hood legend. And I'd probably go along with that. I think I come at it. I'm interested in history, and I've got a history degree. I recognize the importance of historical accuracy on an academic level, but I come to it as a storyteller and as a filmmaker, looking at images and the emotional power of those images and what kind of connects to me on a creative level. So to me, it does have these associations, and the characteristics of a trickster that you might find in the woods, or some kind of elf or fairy, I think are there in the ballads, like you were saying. That kind of ability to blend into the woods, and that use the woods as a his ease of travel through the woods, his ease of hiding in the woods, and using being able to disguise himself in the forest, I think has it almost a magical quality, almost a Tarzan like ability to use that environment in a way that a human wouldn't be able to normally use it.
Mhm.
And to hide from the sheriff for so long, to ambush people in the woods. And I think that kind of blending of the forest is quite a magical quality. So I think coincidental links with Robin Goodfellow as a name is a really good name. That it just seems like a Robin Hood kind of name, that Robin Goodfellow name. And of course, Robin Goodfellow is a, another nickname for Puck, which is a folkloric figure found in Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare one, but has kind of bigger roots throughout English and British history and Celtic history as and Scandinavian, like kind of pan-European puka, shape-shifting fairy. And I really like that idea of that fairy, and I think the DNA of that fairy, for all it might not, Robin Hood tales might not be inspired by that fairy. I think I like seeing the DNA threads of these characters, and that I kind of approach things in a very syncretistic kind of view of what if you could meld that with that, and what if there is a link between that and that, and use it as a creative way to tell a story. So I think that link in the DNA of Puck is in Robin Hood's actions and that sense of magic quality to him. And I don't think Robin Hood is alone in that. I think the DNA of Puck is in Peter Pan, J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, like maybe to a larger extent in there. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that, and there'll be other characters around European folklore as well who maybe have that too. So I think that kind of universal storytelling imagery, which is probably a lot of what we're going to be seeing throughout this chat of those kind of what are those universal images that come in the woods through folklore and through and come in these stories. I think that DNA of Puck is in Peter Pan, but probably in Robin Hood as well. That magic, fairy, like elf-like quality um, is there. Uh, so that's kind of association with Puck. But then the one of the strongest ones for me, which will link to the May games as well, which I think we'll probably talk about, is that the Green Man
Mm-hmm.
imagery, and we can kind of talk about that. But I think that kind of being part of the forest, being like I like that idea of a forest spirit. Now, again, I know the Green Man is not an old Celtic god and is kind of these foliate heads, which seem to just be decorations in churches from kind of a historian's point of view. There's no kind of attestations of a Celtic or pagan Green Man worship. But from a storytelling point of view, I really like that imagery
Yeah.
of kind of a forest spirit, and I associate that with Robin Hood as well. Not just the color green, but um the as I say, that kind of relationship with the forest as well.
Yeah, so for audience members that might not be very familiar with the Green Man, this is a figure. It is seen on statuary. It's seen in images. It's seen all over the place now in like neo-pagan shops and T-shirts. I've certainly owned a few myself in the past, where you have usually a bearded man, but sometimes the beard is really made of leaves, or his hair might be made out of leaves. Often where we're really getting this image from is these stone carvings, like you were mentioning, in old medieval churches, and we don't know exactly why they were being put there or by who. Sometimes he's sort of regurgitating leaves out of his mouth, but it's some kind of combination of human face, usually male, with foliage, with leaves that are encircling it or part of it or coming out of it. And as you say, it's easy to build stories around that figure. And that's something I know I have done myself many times. I've played role playing characters in games that were kind of based on this idea. It's a figure very, very reminiscent of the Ents in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, especially the way they're described in the books. They're often compared to the Green Knight from
So
Sir
Gawain,
Gawain and the
yeah,
Green Knight. And it's easy to also link Robin Hood with that as a figure that is so intricately tied to the forest.
yeah, and I think there's something in it. Um, Before we get into the May Games thing, there's something quite deep in it, I think, with Robin Hood, which is an idea I really like, which is I think the Green Man is like it's a it ties to religious symbolism from all sorts of religions about regrowth and regeneration. So these kind of vegetation deities where death happens and then there's kind of a resurrection of that figure. So in that way, I think there's similarities to like Osiris, the Egyptian god, but also you could say that of all sorts like Jesus and Christianity.
He
You
is known
can
for resurrecting, it's true.
yeah, you can associate it with that as well, and have Christian symbolism in if that's the way you want to tell your story. So I like that idea. And when it comes to Robin Hood, this is something I was toying with some of the Robin Hood writings I was doing. Um, and then I realized when I caught up with the Robin of Sherwood figures is that idea of, well, if this is going to be resurrected, if this is like an evergreen kind of spirit that can come back, if you get rid of one Robin Hood, can you regrow another one? Is it like is there something in me? Is there something permanent in that regenerative cycle of a spirit of Robin Hood that goes beyond a physical body of Robin Hood? So that is, and again, you can tie that to Christian imagery if you want, or it's probably an older kind of image in religion and mythology. But I like that idea, and I noticed that in the Robin of Sherwood series, it kind of goes, and then it's a kind of clever recasting when one Robin Hood dies, someone else who's also called Robin or
Hmm.
Robert becomes another outlaw figure and takes on that mantle of Robin Hood. So in that way, there's a kind
That's
of role and
spoiler warning for a 35-year-old television show.
yeah, apologies for that one. Um, but there's like a Robin Hood job and a Robin Hood spirit that goes beyond the physical person who is Robin Hood, and I quite like that idea in there as well.
And that show, Robin of Sherwood, which was I believe an ITV series from the 1980s there in the UK. It's one of the first places that I'm aware of that I've really seen that really embrace these supernatural ideas with Robin Hood. Robin Hood and the Merry Men, they're not exactly casting spells, but Robin is this figure that's kind of selected to be the champion of this otherworldly kind of Celtic figure known as Herne the Hunter. And we'll probably have to give a little bit of background about who Herne the Hunter is and how he gets very connected with Robin Hood. And he's another one of these figures who, like, he's mentioned once in Shakespeare. I think there's one area in the UK where there's like a little bit of folklore around him, but is really kind of been latched onto by neo pagans. And there isn't really any evidence of worship of Herne the Hunter, but he gets drafted as into this kind of modern neo-pagan Celtic pantheon. And it's not to say that there wasn't a figure like him. He's often associated with Coronos, and various Irish and Celtic gods that we do know who are worshipped, but how much that's just kind of happenstance of similarity, a little bit like the Robin Goodfellow thing, it's hard to say. But the television show, which is about Robin Hood, latches onto it. It takes that figure, it embraces it, and mysticism is evident throughout. You have witches who really are witches and can cast spells. The first episode has this sorcerer who is able to exert kind of possessive control over people. But you also have um, Christian and Jewish magic that sort of works throughout the show. This idea that, like, all of these religions, the pagan ones and the Abrahamic ones, they're all true in some way, and there's something mystic that's kind of pervades that sort of whole show and that whole atmosphere. And that was a show that was also very influential, very well remembered. And I think a lot of people that draw modern stories about Robin Hood where they lean towards the supernatural find inspiration from that show. Do you find that to be the case for you at all?
Yeah, I think so. Now I've seen it was only in the last couple of years that I saw that show. It probably came out, well, I would have been about 3 years old or something when that came out. So I missed it then, and it's only when I started kind of writing Robin Hood things and talking about Robin Hood and wanting to do that, people were saying, "Oh, well, you should check out that show." So I've since been on ITV and caught up with it, and yeah, it was really interesting how they did that. And like you say, it drew from it had different religions in there, and pagan ones and Jewish ones and Christian ones, and this Herne the Hunter character, he kind of, yeah, nunks Robin as this chosen one, doesn't he? And he appears in, I researched it, something like 17 of the episodes have Herne the Hunter in. And yeah, that was, there was something I was toying with her in the Hunter to write with actually, but couldn't quite figure how to use that figure, whether it was going to be an antagonistic force, or then when I watched Robin of Sherwood and found he was kind of a mentor type figure. But it's an interesting one, and like you say, that Hearn, it might be a coincidence. There's different theories about Hearn. There's supposedly some kind of historical person who it might be associated with in Windsor, but
Windsor, that's
also,
the area. Thank you.
yeah, there are these links to Cernunnos, the kind of horned Gaulish and Celtic god, and similar kind of horned deities which kind of exist around Europe, and that's a really interesting bit of folklore and great imagery with the antlers and
Hmm.
on the head, and uh, a brilliant kind of forest ghost. And yeah, I wasn't really sure how to use that kind of character when I'm looking in that. It's something that I've kind of explored, and I'm not sure where to put that. But that series kind of, I guess the how that series influenced me is how popular it is, and people who love Robin Hood really love that show. So it kind of made me think, oh, these supernatural elements I want to write with, these could actually connect with people. Like people do would like to read books or see films that lean into that kind of element, not just a kind of historical accuracy or a Braveheart version of it or whatever, but something
Hmm.
that is um, does introduce elements of fantasy and folklore in there as well.
Yeah, you really do get that spectrum with the character. One of the last books that I finished reading, I've been reading a lot of Robin Hood fiction lately, and I read Lauren Johnson's Arrow of Sherwood, which is a very meticulously well-researched book. She herself is a historian, and so she really tries to bring that out in a lot of ways. She goes into a lot of detail about the medieval legal system. She utilizes the historical events of the siege of Nottingham. Like it's just dripping with this sort of historical accuracy. The other book I'm reading right now is The Shadow of the Wolf by Tim Hall, which goes just the complete opposite direction, where Robin is hanging out in the forest with Kurnos and getting supernatural powers, and it's incredibly mystical, and it's absolutely non-historic in like almost any sense. Like it feels more like it just is taking place in like a fantasy novel world. It feels more like George R. R. Martin than it does, medieval actual medieval England. And so Robin Hood lends itself to those two extremes, I think, very well. And there's not anything that's right or wrong about it. And I think the character is adaptable that way, especially because there's a certain ahistoricalness about Robin Hood himself. Like we
Yeah,
link him with medieval England, but he's not a verifiable historical figure. There's no way to do it right or wrong because it's all just make believe. It's not like, oh, you're inaccurately telling the story of this character. He didn't really exist. Maybe there was somebody who was a sort of an inspiration, but he's so far removed from the Robin Hood legends anyway that it doesn't really matter. You're not doing that person a disservice. It's already been so muddled by now. Do whatever you
yeah.
want
So
with this character.
I think that is, I think that's right, and we discussed that last time we chatted on our podcast as well with about the fact that because we can't pin him down as a historical figure, and as you say, there might be several of people named Robin Hood at the time who were outlaws. It's quite a nebulous kind of figure anyway, in a way that even people a century or so later, William Wallace isn't. There's a lot more known about
Yeah.
William Wallace, say, than Robin Hood, and because we don't have that kind of historical constraint, we can bend the character in all sorts of different directions.
So what about your work in particular? What have you been doing with the character of Robin Hood, and how have you been pulling in the supernatural elements?
So one of the things that's appealed to me about Robin Hood is I really like the again imagery, which I know isn't, it's some ancient Celtic belief that some kind of Victorian writers wrote about, but um, this kind of creative folkloric imagery of the Oak King and the Holly King. So that for those who don't know, there's this kind of battle happens in folklore where there's the Oak King who represents the summer, who battles the Holly King, which represents the winter, and they battle throughout the year, and their relative powers change depending on the seasons. So coming into summer, that you come into the height of the Oak King's power, representing a rebirth and the growth of the greenery again. And I like seeing Robin Hood as that Oak King type character. In my writing in the minute, I'm toying with at what point that becomes a supernatural element. Then maybe he's just kind of dressed as an Oak King character. So I'm kind of imagery wise, I'm taking liberties with traditional depictions of Robin Hood, of either a hood or the cocked cap, and thinking of these kind of almost like a cult like figure. So I've got kind of the Merry Men, or almost like members of a cult, where Robin has posited himself as like a cult leader who's still doing these brave feats of defeating uh, against it, fighting injustice and dishing out goods to the poor, but is kind of also a little bit of a of a fanatic in a kind of way as well.
Would that be leaning into some kind of pagan old god worship there?
Yeah, but not necessarily pinpointing it as a specific one, or it's just that he's maybe created this. How I'm toying with it is that he's a myth within his own lifetime. So it's kind of, and we coming into, I've written kind of various stages where the story is, but one of the ways into it was to have Maid Marian as the main character, and she discovers, kind of meets Robin Hood as he's already kind of established as having this gang in the forest, and and she kind of comes across him as this kind of cult leader. So I know a lot of films in recent times have done these kind of origin stories of Robin Hood, where Prince of Thieves did it, the Patrick Bergin one did,
Oh yeah, they
where
just about all of them do.
yeah, so most of them do, and you see kind of the Russell Crowe one as well coming. I mean, that was all origin. There was no kind of Robin Hoodness in it really. It was kind of coming from the Crusades and that, and then becoming an outlaw. Whereas I was thinking of doing it where he's already an outlaw, and we kind of come into that where there's a mythos around him at the time, or he's already kind of people. He's already, these events are already happening, but it's there's also at that time they don't know if he's real or not. He's kind of like a mythical figure even within his own lifetime.
So one of the things that we see in the very early ballads is Robin Hood, who is very devout. And in an interesting sort of way, because also in the early ballads, he will straight up, steal from corrupt bishops. He is oppositional to the church, which is presented as a, mostly corrupt institution. But he himself is a devout individual who wants to go to church. He actually gets in trouble in the earliest ballad we have because he wants to go to church, and he especially prays to Saint Mary, mother of Jesus. So we see this kind of devotion to Mary and personal religion that is important to the character. And that sort of religious devotion tends to get dropped by the wayside in more recent adaptations, in that way that a lot of things do. Just for the things that are for popular consumption, we tend to make them very a-religious. We just don't talk a lot about characters' personal religious beliefs in most modern media. So I'm curious where you would be positioning the figures like Robin and Marian in this story. And there's even some speculation that Marian might be entering the stories because Mary was such an important figure for Robin in the early ballads. So if you have this kind of more cultish figure that's a little bit building into that Oak King imagery, is, even though if you're not going fully into that kind of Celtic pagan realms, would you still be presenting the Christian church? And would this sort of Robin Hood, your Robin Hood, have that oppositional element to it?
Yeah, that's something, the kind of religious politics of it is something I'm kind of toying with as well, because I like that idea of Robin Hood kind of criticizing corruption in society wherever that comes, whether it's political or civil life or the religious world of it, kind of breaking through hypocrisy, and also about if you're going to have someone who, and again, there's a danger of trying to insert modern politics into
Hmm.
it. It's got to be relevant to modern politics without it looking like modern politics.
Right.
It's got to feel that it associates with it without you trying to kind of impose a capitalism versus socialism model
Hmm.
onto it when it's not a capitalist society yet. But you can still engage with, well, what's it mean to have elites and to have everyone else in a certain place with no choice about how they go on, or do they have a choice if they band together and have a leader to lead them? Do they have a Is there a way of breaking against elite? So you can kind of take a more fundamental level of elites versus everyone else without it being kind of a capitalist kind of society and business model.
Yeah.
And then if you're bringing elites into it, you in medieval times, as now in to a large extent as well, you kind of looking at the church elite leaders as well, and where do they fall into it? So I think he would be outside of that, and not necessarily. And I haven't made him Christian, like having a Christianity outside of those structures. It's more just him being critical of those structures. And one of the figures, and this isn't necessarily a mythological one, but isn't there in some of the ballads, and you'll know this more than me, but isn't there like a abbess who's one of the antagonists of a
Yeah.
ballad?
Yes. Very, very famously, the Abbess of Kirklees, who is responsible for the death of Robin, who uh, is his kin. She's related to him. She's his cousin, but she's having a secret affair with Sir Robert of Doncaster. I think. Yeah, I think that's right. One of the sheriff's kind of associates, and when he comes to her when he is feeling ill and she is going to bleed him to help restore him, help revive him, as in the medieval practice of bleeding to let out the bad blood, she bleeds him too much. She intentionally bleeds him unto his death.
Yeah, so there is that kind of, and that's something. I mean, I need to research that ballad and that figure. But when I was looking at kind of how do you represent the religious structures, then there are kind of characters you could draw from the ballads to say to go, oh, what if I did my version of that abbess, and if that is about putting representing the people who want to keep those elite structures in place. So you could have political ones of that of the sheriff or Guy of Gisborne, who represents keeping elites in place politically, and also then you could have the religious version of that, which is the abbess imposing that order and keeping those there. Because then you can have the opposite of that, which is maybe perhaps Friar Tuck, who's a character you could use to go, well, what is a religious figure who opposes that kind of structure
Hmm.
and that order? And so in that sense, that's just kind of drawing up positions and casting from the available characters in the Robin
Yeah.
Hood canon, as it were. Um, but then so that's kind of the setting out the day-to-day reality of that world. But then I like then pushing characters into the corners of, well, what's the the mythology version of that character that I can kind of push to and push
Hmm.
that to that corner as well. So some of them are less kind of mythological, where some of the characters that I was thinking of, whereas others like Robin Hood and Little John and Maid Marian um, would be very kind of drawn from mythology.
Yeah, certainly a lot of the characters it's easy to get archetypal with, even if they're not overtly mystical. I mean, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of and that's really where some of these figures even come from, like Friar Tuck. He enters the Robin Hood stories also via the Mayday games, and it's probably just because they incorporated a stock character of a jolly friar. He's just an archetype, this jolly friar character who likes a bit of, wine and drink and can be, a very happy jolly person as opposed to a dour priest or something. And he becomes incorporated as a full character who's been interpreted many different ways in the Robin Hood lore, but he still has that DNA, as you mentioned before, of being just this archetypal figure. And I think there's a lot that can be seen with those characters where you don't have to make them supernatural to still kind of draw off of those kind of archetypes.
Yeah, and those kind of, because there's a kind of level of being stock characters that you might get in a certain type of play, like the Mayday games, or Mummers plays in other parts of English folk plays from way back, or pantomime as the kind of modern equivalent, which I'm not a big fan of, but those kind of folk plays have a kind of set of stock characters in, like movies do now. Your teen movies or whatever always have these stock characters in. So there's a level of being a stock character, and then there's kind of like a mythological archetype behind that as well to on some of them. So if you look at like Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell, who was for people listening, he was like a comparative mythologist who studied a lot of stories and wrote about these kind of comparisons of stories and mythology and history. And lots of James Fraser did it in the Victorian times as well. There's Carl Jung, like psychologist, drew from
Mm-hmm.
these images that he said were kind of within the human psyche, and I like kind of looking at those, and I think there's some element of that where you can find similar kind of images of characters and elements from stories across the world, which then naturally will find themselves in Robin Hood, something that is this kind of big adventure stories set in the wildness of the woods. You are going to bring in those archetypes from Young and everywhere, and they will come through in those types of stories.
Yeah, I was recently reading the book Robin Hood by John Matthews, which I actually picked up from the gift shop in Sherwood Forest. And in it, he quotes the author Lord Raglan, who wrote in his 1936 book The Hero, which is another one of these books that's examining these kind of mythic archetypes. He referenced Robin Hood as a deity type figure associated with spring and vegetation, which then makes him very much part of the association with the King of the May as well, and ties into that Oak King notion that you were discussing earlier. So we
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely how I envisage that character. Yeah.
Yeah, and you also get this figure that pops up in medieval literature and in medieval art of the wood woes, the kind of the wild
Mhm.
man. And this sometimes also gets drawn into associations with that green man imagery and the woodland figure. And I've definitely seen depictions of Little John, just as we're getting into this idea of these sort of mythic archetypes that we can draw with the Robin Hood characters. I've seen depictions of Little John where he is presented in that sort of way, where he is sort of almost less of a man and more of a wild man. Not necessarily the Green Man or King of the May or the Oak King like Robin Hood, but just somebody who is more like Enkidu from Gilgamesh, more just a figure that encompasses the that represents the sort of lack of civilization.
Yeah, there's a great drawing by the artist PJ Richards, who I follow on Twitter, and they've drawn a little John with a staff who's like as a wood wars kind of wild
Oh,
man,
that's great.
and it's brilliant, and that's that's a great example of what I like doing with the characters. Of Little John is always portrayed as a bit wild and rough and down to earth, and in a lot of the movies, he's the one with the big hair and the big beard. So
Mhm.
he's like on the verge of that kind of. He's a very narrow end of the wedge of that archetype that we've seen in these movies. But I like the idea of pushing him back into that archetype and going, well, what if we did present him as a wild man? So really get to the full core of that archetype, and and that kind of wood wars. So wood wars is a folkloric figure in European folklore, and it's an old English word of these kind of wild men, hairy wild men who live in the woods. And I think that that archetype is great. You can see that in Yetis and Bigfoot, kind of to some extent,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but also in there's an element of that, and this is what an insight or something I was thinking with Little John. There's an element of that in John the Baptist in the Bible. He's figured as he wears kind of some tattered loincloth clothes, so he's kind of roaming around the desert semi-naked. Everyone thinks he's kind of crazy. He eats just locusts and honey, I think, doesn't he? So he's
Hmm,
presented as
interesting.
being in the Bible as being outside of society, and so I think these kind of wild men type figures appear in religions and storytelling, and I like that idea of John the Baptist, and in a lot of the stories, Robin Hood and Little John have a fight in the river, and he pushes Robin Hood in the river. So I quite like that idea of it being almost like a John the Baptist imagery without being mentioned explicitly, but him kind of baptizing Robin Hood in the river, and that kind of beginning the journey together.
That's an interesting one. That is definitely an angle that, oh boy, did that one has never crossed my plate before.
Yeah, I think I'm the only one I know who's seen that, who's done that so far. Someone else might have done somewhere, but I like that kind of idea.
Yeah, and there's and that there are stories that do make that kind of connection with baptism. In Ooh, I don't know where this crops up first, but I know I've definitely seen some older stories where that story happens, where Little John knocks Robin Hood into the river, and then Robin Hood calls all of his men, and at first they're all going to attack Little John, and he's like, "No, no, no, this guy's great," and that is when they give him the name of Little John, where he had been John Little or John of Heathersage or something before, and there's at least one or two versions I've read where it is played off as a baptizing. Oh, we will now baptize him as Little John. He is this new wee babe, and which is of course a joke because he's such a big guy who has now been baptized and given this new name. So that idea of it's John getting baptized, but you're right. If John is the one that is sort of the outsider figure, and Robin is the one that's actually like really getting knocked into the river by the story, in the story, then that's a really fun direction to take that as well too.
Yeah, so I like that kind of idea, and that being part of drawn from other mythologies and Christian mythology as well, and I think there are kind of images that like you mentioned before about Robin Hood, and that Lord Raglan saying he's kind of represents that deity kind of god of rebirth, and as I mentioned before, that there's kind of Christian imagery, which I think isn't just exclusively Christian imagery. I think it's kind of a wider kind of mythological imagery in different gods and different societies throughout time of kind of dying and rising gods, and that kind of resurrection. And I like playing on that idea of Robin Hood, and can that Robin Hood die, and can another one carry on that
Mhm.
same mission, and can the merry men carry on that same mission of Robin Hood's mission out there, like we saw in Robin of Sherwood, and can maybe that's something I'm interested in as well.
Are there any of the other figures associated with Robin Hood that you've been drawing these kind of mythic parallels to?
Yeah, so I've tried to do that with kind of push all the characters out of these mythologies. I'm trying with this might be a brief part of the conversation because I'm a bit stuck with this one, but the kind of Alan Dale stroke Will Scarlet fool type archetype, and it's whether I combine those characters or separate them, and I know that's a thing that they kind of sometimes get melded in some of the presentations, sometimes not. But yeah, and I researched kind of medieval jesters as well, and what the reality of that was, which is actually really interesting. They had roles on the battlefield, and they also had roles in court with advising the king. They were actually quite intelligent, quite important people, and that was interesting. But also that fool type archetype as well, and playing with that. But then the main one that I've really had a lot of fun with is Maid Marian, and as I say, that's maybe the angle I'm taking with it, is have Maid Marian as a main character. And I know it's been done before, and you had a podcast recently with Teresa Tomlinson, about the Forest Wife trilogies, which I've not read because I kind of got a feeling that there might be some similarities with what I was thinking. So I thought I'm going to have my own go first, and then I'll
Sure,
read it
sure.
and see what's similar, what I need to change. But I
Reasonable.
kind of didn't want to be influenced by it yet. So I'm looking forward to reading those. But yeah, Maid Marian is really interesting. And I think I had like three maybe main levels of mythology going into that. So the May games, as you mentioned, and so the May games are well, you can fill this in on the history of it, but it's kind of a folklore festival at like May time, and it's one of my favorite times of year because everything goes green in England, and it's a big celebration among certain communities, and it comes from older traditions, beltane and Celtic traditions, same time of year, and big festival. And even now, we have lots of places in England, especially in the south, not so much where I'm from in the northeast, but in the south, they have festivals. So in Shropshire, there's the Green Man of Clun festival. In Hastings, they have the Jack and the Green festival. So Jack and the Green is like a modern iteration of that. So that is like a conical shape that's covered in greenery and plonked over. It started with chimney sweeps in the 1800s. But I think that again, that's a modern festival, but the DNA of celebrating the greenery, celebrating the return of the spring, the DNA
Mhm.
links to the Green Man figure are in that festival, and it's huge. So the one in Hastings, I did a podcast episode with the organizer of that, and the imagery there, they have people dressed in those ones, but then the whole town dresses like that and parades through the streets, and it's amazing. And there's lots of festivals like that happen around, so that's still going. And so that's the kind of Green Man, King of the Main. I like that idea of Robin Hood being represented there. But I think traditionally in the May Games, that was in history, they had similar festivals, and they had kind of Robin Hood figures would be part of those May Games, weren't they? That was a big part of the kind of popularization of Robin Hood, and the Friar Tuck figure, like you said. And that in the history of Robin Hood, that was a big part in the growth of the legend. So I like that kind of link to the medieval historical past, or kind of late medieval period. But then also it's Maid Marian, who I think is the strongest link in there. And that kind of comes in three ways to that. So the first one is as May Queen. So that is a like representing the queen of the spring beginning, and celebrating this kind of fertility and new growth and all of that. And I like that. And Marion kind of came in there from French origins. Is that right?
That is, it is speculated that she comes in through these French origins, where there had been some poems about shepherdesses, including one named Marian. These kind of pastoral plays and poems that included a figure named Marian, and there was certainly a lot of contact between England and France, and that could be how she got brought in.
Mm-hmm.
I've not ever seen anything that really made a definitive case for it, but I've seen some mighty assured speculation.
Yeah, it's because that is a great kind of figure, and there's folklore and folk customs in England about having May garlands, so kind of hawthorn branches, which are all these lovely white flowers come out in the May time, and there's cherry blossoms starting on the trees at the moment, which looks great. All these pink and white blossoms coming up, and that's kind of those kind of floral images of pastoral images, and kind of crowns made of flowers for the May Queen, and crowns made of leaves for the May King. And that's something in the Uma Thurman, Patrick Bergen, Robin Hood. They borrow that a little bit for their wedding at the end. They have someone dressed as a green man, so the type that you see in Hastings and Clun and all these other towns and villages in the south of England. That imagery's a little bit in that Robin Hood in the 1991 Bergen one. So I like that idea. But I think when you get, so that's drawn from folklore, but then there's a deeper mythology that probably feeds into that folklore as well. So if you push it back into mythology, it draws associations with the goddess of Astara, which is a pan-European kind of goddess. Again, it's a thing that neo-pagans have taken up, and
Yes.
they celebrate that around the equinox. And so again, there's a historians would argue about that and the accuracy of it, but if people can believe what they want to believe, and to me, I'm interested in that figure as the imagery of it, and as a source of storytelling. It is attested by a Northumbrian historian, Saint Bede, in the 9th century, who said that the old Anglo-Saxons in Kent worshipped Estro, which is or Estra, which is where we get the word Easter from, and they had Estra Monath. So that kind of became the English word for Easter, where it's
Yeah.
rather than the Latin word. And so there is kind of some historical attestations of that in Germany and in the south of England.
Right. And
Uh,
that part's not speculative. That is very decidedly where the name Easter comes from here.
yeah. So I like you. So when you have a May Queen and celebrating that, I think there's, again, it might not be a concrete historical journey all the way through, but I think in terms of the DNA of it and why it becomes popular is people like to personify seasons, and people like to, this time of year where the days are getting lighter, where the flowers are out, the daffodils are out, the bluebells are coming, all these cherry blossoms are out. That celebration of the spring and personifying that in the May Queen, I think also links to this image of Astara, and there's stories about hares and deer, and kind of links to nature and animals with that figure as well. And so when I'm playing with the Marian idea, I like the May Queen idea, but I also like this kind of nature goddess idea as well, that feeds into that imagery. So that's my kind of natural flowery nature side of Marion. But
Mm-hmm.
I also have a steelier kind of warrior side of it, a kind of Hunger Games version of Marion, where so have more depth of character, which I know made Marion in a lot of depictions or more modern ones is that kind of more fierce, kind of active, not just one of the men, but something's leading the men or fighting alongside the men, and showing those kind of hunting skills and sword skills. So thinking of imagery of Marion firing the bow and arrow, there's goddesses in Greco-Roman mythology. So
Ah, yeah.
Diana, the hunter, and the Greek version is Artemis, I think. So
Hmm.
Diana was goddess of the hunt. So it's kind of, you can reach back into mythologies and history, and pull kind of similar imagery through. And then I mean, the Crown did this with Princess Diana. They kind of played on the idea of Diana the hunter a little bit in one of their episodes as well. So I think it's kind of imagery that you can use in storytelling and pull back from Roman mythology and put in there.
That is a very interesting way to go. And I picked up this notebook that I have on me where I keep a lot of my notes for the podcast. And I put a sticker on it that came as like a kind of backer thing for the Rescuing Robin Hood board game. And it's got a depiction of Maid Marian there. And as you can see, not only is she carrying a bow and has her quiver of arrows, she's even barefoot. That really lends itself very much to that kind of Artemis Diana sort of idea. And it even really works with the name Maid Marian, because you sometimes get these stories where they put some emphasis on her being a maid. Oh, she'll be a maid until King Richard returns. And so that could even be a good kind of mythic connection between Artemis or Diana, who is infamously the virgin sort of goddess of the hunt. Well, I'm really quite taken with both the sides of that coin, both the May Queen flower goddess of the spring, but also that sort of huntress imagery.
Yeah, and that's why I think you can get that duality with Maid Marian, and you, so that kind of the duality in the mythology of it, and then in the and I mean there's great imagery of Astara, which again, like any of these ones, it gets sometimes co-opted by the wrong people, but it's a great kind of imagery of that flower and fertility ones, and then this kind of hunting imagery. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's duality in the mythology you can draw, but then there's also duality in the everyday reality of Marion, of that in betweenness of, is she part of the court? Is she part of Sherwood? And then
Yeah.
a lot of stories she's like the go, like
Mm-hmm.
a kind of shape shift and go between of those. And so one of the things I'm toying with is, where do you start with Marion, and does she change allegiances, or is she, and if you're going to have her as a protagonist, which I'm developing, then you may be changing that, what she's like at the start compared to the end, and what's the journey she goes on, if
Yeah.
and what's the lesson you want to present to the audience that Marion has learned. So you're playing with those kind of opposites of location and society that she's in, and does she have to leave the high court society, or does she ever really fit into there? And that's something I'm toying with as well. Is she still a misfit in there, and then kind of gets cast out and has to live among the peasants and the yeomen and the outlaws, and that what opens her eyes, as it is in Adventures of Robin Hood, and other ones, where that's what kind of makes her see the reality of life outside the castle walls, and then kind of becomes a leader amongst those as well.
Yeah. No, that sounds like a interesting creative journey for you there.
Yeah,
I
and that
really look forward to finding where it takes you.
yeah, there's a lot still to go in it, and kind of in figuring out what's the lesson she learns. Therefore, what do you want the audience to take away, and pinpointing exactly what the takeaway is. Is it to you? Because I'm kind of leaning some way at times lean towards, is it about protecting the environment from these elites? Is it about your role in not accepting social structures being imposed on you, and being able to change that,
Hmm.
and kind of, yeah, trying to just kind of tie it down more specifically to that. So yeah, that in amongst the mythology of it, and all these things, it's also what's the core message you want the audience to take away, and therefore how are you presenting Marion, my protagonist, in relation to these other characters, to get across that core message. So yeah, it's a big journey to go on.
Along those lines of these sort of mythic roles for the characters, something occurred to me for Alan a Dale, and I don't know if this is something you've already thought of and rejected, but it also occurred to me because I discussed this story a little bit in my interview with Richard Firth Green, where we discussed the story of Sir Orfeo, this kind of medieval poem, this sort of courtly poem, which was this sort of medieval adaptation of the story of Orpheus. And in both of them, they're about this man who has this musical talent, who is pining for his lost bride and goes on a journey to get her back. And that's the core of how the Alan a Dale character is introduced in the Robin Hood stories, is the ballad of Alan a Dale, which is about this lovelorn minstrel who, in his case, that his bride hasn't died, but she is about to be married off to somebody else, and Robin helps reunite the lovers and disrupts the other wedding, and orchestrates their wedding. But it still kind of casts him in this very Orpheus-like role as this musician who is pining for his lady love, his erstwhile bride.
Yeah. So I wasn't familiar with that story of it, but that's the kind of thing that I would like to do with these characters, is give them kind of links to it, of kind of funnel through a deeper kind of, from a deeper mythology, and even if you are kind of presenting a thin edge of the wedge there, then there still feels like there's a force behind it coming into there, even if you're not explicitly mentioning it.
Yeah, yeah, you don't have to, just show a big spotlight on it and say, Alan a Dale is Orpheus. You're allowed to be a little more subtle, even when you're trying to build around mythic archetypes.
Yeah, so yeah, that whether I do Alan Adale or Will Scott as separate characters, or that's something that I'm kind of yeah, playing with. But I do like that idea and having that kind of extra color that you bring with a kind of musician and the muse of coming through there.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds really fun. I'm really excited. And I wish you so much luck working on it.
Thank you. I shall be keeping you up to date, and I shall be sending you bits and pieces as I work on them. And I'd love to see what you think of them as a work in progress.
Oh, I'd be very happy to take a look. I would love that very much. All right. So before I let you go, do you have any last thoughts that you want to share? Anything you wanted to make sure you mentioned or get out about this, about either your work or about where you see Robin Hood or the associated figures as having a role in our society or our literature as somehow supernatural or mythic?
Yeah, it's just I think just in conclusion, I think they are these archetypes that storytellers can use in whatever form of storytelling, and it's something I've kind of sometimes drawn upon explicitly, sometimes less so. And in comparative mythology, these archetypes are there. So I think Robin Hood certainly lends itself by the kind of nebulous nature of that character, by the wildness of the situation in the location in the forest, and then you kind of get these magical and mystical associations of dryads and all those nature spirits. So it's definitely something that I think it lends itself to. But I think the challenge with any of that and drawn from any mythology is what is relevant for the audience today, without
Hmm.
making it kind of really anachronistic or trying to impose too many modern sensibilities or modern decorations onto it. It's still got to feel like there's an important message for the audience to take home today as well. And I think that's part of the challenge as well.
Yeah.
So yeah,
All right. I think that's a good thought to end on. Uh,
brilliant. And yeah, and if people want to follow me, so I run a podcast where we look at mythology and
mhm.
folklore tales and magic realism, and I interview filmmakers and artists and storytellers. So and we've done a great episode with you, Thaddeus, about Robin Hood. So where we dig into the legend in there. So and I've also got an episode about the May Games and
Yeah.
um, the Green Man festivals and the Jack and the Green Festival at Hastings. So audiences who like Robin Hood might want to check those episodes out. And that is at Dreamswarm, www.dreamswarm.org, all one word. Or we're on Twitter at underscore at dream underscore swarm, and you can find me there.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to include both those links in the episode description as well. And I do strongly recommend checking them out. I did listen to that episode about the Mayday games. I thought it was a really fascinating interview. He really gets deep into the kind of local customs and the traditions and his role in making them happen, and the roles that others, his kind of compatriots around the country, have in making them happen.
Yeah, it's great bit of folklore and folk custom, and a great time of year to celebrate that. I always kind of get that feel of spring coming in it, and I love in that imagery and the kind of fertility and regrowth imagery. But I also at this time, yeah, I always think of Robin Hood. It just seems synonymous with that imagery. So it's great to be talking to you today about Robin Hood and about that springtime imagery.
Yeah, one of the things that I discussed when I interviewed Andrew West, who works in Sherwood, was I read a passage from the Howard Pyle's Merry Adventures of Robin Hood that's all about the May, and the sun dappling through the leaves and the birds singing, and the whole book is like that throughout, where you just get that joyous springtime feeling, where Robin Hood seems to live in this perpetual perfect weather. It's always the merry month of May. And again, like, that's a book where nothing is overtly supernatural occurring in any way, yet he is still becomes this archetypal figure of the May, perhaps even by accident, just because he lends himself to it so well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again so much. I know it's really late for you now. It's after midnight for you there, so I can let you get to bed.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Thaddeus. I've enjoyed this.
Always lovely to talk to you.
All right, thanks. Take
All right.
care.
Cheers,
Bye.
Andy. My thanks again to Andy Mark Simpson, and be sure to check the episode description for links to information about his films and to the Dream Swarm podcast. You can also find his episode about Jack in the Green in the Into the Greenwood feed, where it was cross-posted last year. It's a very insightful interview, and as with all of his work, Andy's sense of curiosity and kindness really shines through. I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that this would be the first in a series exploring the topic of Robin Hood and the supernatural. And next week, I'll be releasing another interview with the author J. Tullis Hennig, whose 5-novel series features a decidedly druidic Robin Hood. We'll also be discussing more about the Robin of Sherwood television show, as J. Tullis Hennig was a personal friend with Richard Carpenter, the lead writer and creator of the show, as well as discussing some of its supernatural elements in fitting with our theme. Before we go, though, I need to make a few quick announcements. Unfortunately, Into the Greenwood is not self-sustaining at this point, and some changes will have to be made. Firstly, is monetization. I've been trying to avoid it, but it's likely that I will need to start running ads in the show. I promise to do my best to limit how intrusive they are. The second is to the Patreon. Since Into the Greenwood has had an irregular release schedule, I have avoided monthly fees for our supporters. However, I realize that that sort of irregularity makes budgeting more difficult and creates hesitancy to become a backer. This will put the onus on me to create a more consistent release schedule, and that's just what will have to happen. For our backers, there won't be many changes to the reward tiers. All backers, even at the $1 level, will get access to ad-free episodes. And everyone at the Merry Bandit level and above will still get bonus audio content. For the Notorious Outlaw level, we'll come up with some fun new bits of swag or other rewards. These changes will be made during the month of March to go into effect at the start of April. To find out more and to help support the show, go to patreon.com/intogreenwood. For those hesitant to sign up for recurring donations, but willing to leave a show of appreciation for the time and effort that goes into making these episodes, we also have an account at buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood. We will remain staunchly true to our commitment to charity, and 10% of all proceeds will go directly towards our selected charity, which remains Trees, Water, and People. Of course, immensely helpful is also the absolutely free writing of positive reviews and 5-star ratings on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and the like. Also free and incredibly helpful is letting your friends know about the show, sharing it on social media, and anything else that just helps others know that we exist. You can find us on pretty much all of the major social media platforms with the handle @intogreenwood, and you can get in touch directly via email with intogreenwood@gmail.com. We're also active in a Discord server set up by a friend of the show, Mike Nichols, where community members share art, have fun discussions, run a book club, and much more. Just get in touch if you would like an invitation. That should cover everything for now. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, safe travels to you, one and all, until our next journey together into the Greenwood.